Welcome. So we are now live broadcasting on YouTube. So welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name's Andrea Bassing-Matney, and we're very pleased to have you here either on site or joining us on YouTube. Before we begin, again, I wanted to remind our on-site audience, because our presenter is coming in remotely on screen, in order for him to hear your question, please use the aisle microphones. Otherwise, he won't hear your question. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can also submit questions using the chat feature on YouTube. Please just log in first, type your question in, and at the end of the program, I will ask your question for you. You'll also find on this YouTube webpage a link to the presentation slides, so you can download those, and you can also find captioning, so you can open that website up and get the captioning there. And if you're here on site and you're having trouble hearing, we also have a monitor here, and you can see the words being typed as he speaks. So for today's program, as you know, the Truman Doctrine and the Origins of the Cold War is by presenter Samuel W. Rushay, Jr., and he's broadcasting from the Harry S. Truman Library. Sam will discuss the historical significance of the Truman Doctrine in the observance of its 70th anniversary. So Sam is currently the Supervisory Archivist at the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. And as you can see on your screen, there's a full biography, but I'd like to get right into the program. So ladies and gentlemen, if Sam is ready, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Sam Rushay.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to speak with you about a landmark document in American and world history, the Truman Doctrine. And what I want to share with you this afternoon are some details about that landmark document and its background and its enduring significance. And I will start with some slides here to talk about the Truman Doctrine. And the photographs you see here and the sound recording I'll play come from the archives here at the Harry S. Truman Library. 70 years ago, on March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman gave a speech before a joint session of Congress that would shape the future course of American foreign policy for the next 40-plus years. In his speech, the president outlined what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He stated that it would be the policy of the United States to help free nations to resist attempted subjugation by outside groups or armed minorities. Furthermore, he said that the U.S. must help free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. The immediate cause of President Truman's speech was a political crisis and civil war in Greece, which also threatened its neighbor, Turkey. The broader context for his speech was political turmoil and unrest in Western and Southern Europe, which had not recovered from the devastation of World War II, as well as the existence of Soviet-controlled governments in Eastern Europe. By way of backstory, the Truman Doctrine was issued in the midst of a civil war in Greece between communist insurgents and non-communist, although an undemocratic government. In the spring of 1946, Greek communists, who had played a leading role in fighting the Nazi occupation during World War II, boycotted elections that resulted in the formation of a rightist government or conservative government under Prime Minister Konstantin Tsaldaris, who became Prime Minister of Greece in April 1946 until January 1947. His government carried out the plebiscite on the return of the monarchy in August of 1946, which meant that the king, King Paul, returned from exile, where he lived in London and Cairo during most of World War II in exile during the Nazi occupation. This is a photo of King Paul from our collection From Cairo, King Paul broadcast messages to the Greek peoples during the war, and he returned to Greece in 1946, succeeding to the throne in 1947 during the Greek Civil War, which again was between Greek communists and non-communist Greek government. Some of these photos I'll show you here in the next few slides will attest. Greece was a devastated land that felt the effects of and ravages of World War II. During the war and toward its end, retreating Germans destroyed railways, ports, roads, and the merchant marine. Villages were burned. Children suffered from tuberculosis. The economy was devastated. Inflation skyrocketed, wiping out savings. Neighboring Bulgaria also suffered from the ravages of war. It was at this point that the National Liberation Front, in which communists did occupy a prominent position, resorted to armed struggle to topple the Greek regime, headed by, as I say, Prime Minister Saldaris and King Paul. The neighboring communist nations of Albania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia offered aid to the insurgency, but Premier Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, recognizing an agreement he had made with Winston Churchill during the war, which recognized a British sphere of influence in Greece in exchange for the Soviets having the upper hand in Romania, provided very limited support, actually, to the Greek insurgents. Again, this was sort of the deal that was made where Stalin took a more or less hands-off approach to Greece, at least at this stage. Stalin did reverse policy, following American intervention in the area, but his support for the Greek rebels did tend to be limited. What's significant, though, is at the time, the U.S. government did believe the Soviet Union supported the Greek communist war effort and worried that if the communists prevailed in the Civil War, the Soviets would ultimately influence Greek policy and the form of the government. As I say, Stalin, did deliberately refrain from providing any direct support and forced this Yugoslav Prime Minister Tito to follow suit, which did damage Soviet-Yugoslav relations. However, a number of other foreign policy problems influenced President Truman's decision to actively aid Greece and Turkey. And this context is very important. In 1946, there were several setbacks that kind of torpedoed a chance of achieving a durable post-war peace or rapprochement with the Soviet Union. And briefly, again, these are things that we don't have time to get into, but the Soviets' failure to withdraw their troops from northern Iran in early 1946 was an important factor. Soviet attempts to pressure the Iranian government into giving them oil concessions was another factor. That Soviet efforts to force the Turkish government into granting them base and transit rights through the Turkish Straits, and the Soviet government's rejection of the Beirut Plan for international control of nuclear energy and weapons in 1946, all were factors in President Truman's ultimate decision to issue the Truman Doctrine. That context, I think, is very important. Add to this the important ideas of George Kennan, who was a State Department diplomat. Kennan issued a couple of very important documents expressing his point of view in 1946, what's referred to as the Long Telegram, as well as the X article. And these became a part of the basis of Truman's foreign policy. And in the X article of 1947, he said that the main element of any U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. It's important to note he did criticize an early draft of the Truman Doctrine, which he thought was overly rhetorical in its tone. He did feel that the Soviet threat was primarily economic and psychological more than military. And in the long telegram issued the year before, in 1946, he said that he believed that the Soviet Union historically had a, quote, neurotic worldview. I should say the Soviet leaders' worldview tended to be neurotic, and that the actions of Stalin should be seen in that light. He viewed them as having historical insecurity, as Soviet leadership and Russian leadership historically, and that they sought, quote, security only in patient but deadly struggle for total destruction of a rival power, never in compacts and compromises with it, end quote. Again, those are George Kennan's views, which were very influential in the State Department, and in turn impacted President Truman's views. Another part of the story here is the Clifford LZ Report, which was issued about this time, 1946. Again, it's important to remember the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States during World War II, but shortly after the ending of the war, relations started to sour, and as this report was an influential report indicated, there were hopes for Soviet troop withdrawals from Greece so they could set up a friendly government there. That's the view of the Clifford LZ Report, and that Turkey would become a puppet state of the Soviets. The Clifford LZ Report said that the United States should support all democratic countries that are being menaced or endangered by the Soviet Union. Harry Truman read this report and felt it was very, very sensitive. In fact, reading it one night, he called Clark Clifford and asked how many copies of this report existed. Clifford said there were 10. Truman replied he wanted 9 of them put under lock and key because of the sensitivities that he saw there. So that sets the background for what would become an important meeting in February 1947 at the White House. And there's a photo here of one of the important players, George Marshall, Secretary of State. And then on the right here is a screenshot of our presidential calendar for February 27, 1947. And you'll note there at the 10 a.m. meeting, hopefully you can read that, but it indicates the attendees at this important meeting in February 1947. Congressional leaders were there as well, as was Dean Acheson, who was then Under Secretary of State. Acheson would then later become Secretary of State beginning in 1949, but at this time he's Undersecretary, working under Secretary Marshall, pictured here. Acheson put the crisis that the U.S. faced in bold and frank terms. He described Soviet pressure in northern Iran, in the Turkish Straits, which were the keys to access to the Mediterranean, historically sought by the Soviet Union or Russia, who wanted a warm water port through the Turkish Straits, and the threat to Greece. He said, quote, like apples in a barrel infected by a rotten one, the corruption of Greece would infect Iran and all to the east. That infection would spread to Africa and to Europe. Acheson, who's pictured here, his argument persuaded the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg, who was a Michigan Republican, to support the administration's position. Now, why had this meeting occurred at this time? Why February 1947? The British had announced shortly before that they could no longer bear the burden of maintaining economic and military support for Greece and Turkey. Traditionally, they had been the power in that region. But the result of World War II, the strains of World War II, meant they could no longer financially bear that burden. In this photo here, which is from our collection, President Truman is shaking hands with the British ambassador. It's important to note, as Henry Kissinger observed in his book, Diplomacy, that, quote, Truman was prepared to take over Great Britain's historic role of blocking a Russian advance toward the Mediterranean. This sets the tone for Truman's actual speech of March 12, 1947. In his memoirs, Truman described the communist threat that he felt he needed to address in this speech. He said, quote, this new menace facing us seemed every bit as grave as Nazi Germany and her allies had been, end quote, during World War II. He insisted that the nation must not slip back into isolationism as it had following World War I. Inaction, withdrawal, Fortress America notions would only result in handing to the Russians vast areas of the world. Truman felt that it was the duty of the United States to be at the head of the free world. He stated that it would be the policy of the United States to help free nations resist attempted subjugation by outside groups or armed minorities, as they say, and that the U.S. must help free peoples work out their own destinies in their own way. In addition to Greece, Truman asked Congress to provide assistance to Turkey, since that nation too had been previously dependent on British aid. He argued that a communist victory in the Greek Civil War would endanger the political stability of Turkey, which would undermine the political stability of the Middle East. An early enunciation of what later would become known as the domino theory, although Truman did not use that term, domino theory. Truman said this could not be allowed in light of the region's immense strategic importance to the U.S. national security. He also argued that the United States was compelled to assist free peoples in their struggles against totalitarian regimes because the spread of authoritarianism would undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. American national security now depended more than on just the physical security of American territory. In a sharp break with its traditional avoidance of extensive foreign commitments beyond the Western Hemisphere during peacetime that was enunciated in the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, the Truman Doctrine committed the United States to actively offer assistance to preserve the political integrity of democratic nations when such an offer was deemed to be in the best interest of the United States. Interestingly, in the Truman Doctrine speech, President Truman never mentioned the Soviet Union, but the necessity of preventing the expansion of Soviet expansionism was foremost in his mind. Here's a photo of President Truman during the speech, greeting Arthur Vandenberg, that same Republican senator from Michigan, and Speaker of the House, Joseph Martin, on the right. Congress at this time was controlled by Truman's opposition party, the Republican Party. Truman was a Democrat, and in 1946, the Republicans seized control of both houses of Congress. So this was an example of bipartisan foreign policy. Both houses of the Republican-controlled Congress would vote by large majorities to approve the Greek-Turkish Aid Bill that was a part of this. In the speech, Truman actually outlined the ideology or the reasons for needing this shift in U.S. foreign policy. But there was money behind it as well. And he implored Congress to grant $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. And by large majorities, the Republican Congress voted to approve it. Even a staunch isolationist such as Robert Taft of Ohio voted to approve it. Commenting on the vote in his book, A Preponderance of Power, historian Melvin Loeffler noted there would be no resurgence of isolationism. Well, what's going on in the United States at this time? Just a few days after Truman's speech of March 12, about 9 days later, an executive order was issued creating a loyalty review board. And the reason I point this out is just to provide a sense of context of what's going on in the United States at the same time. There's a fear of communist subversion in the federal government, and this executive order required full-scale loyalty investigations of new employees and required the setting up of procedures to verify the loyalty of existing employees. The statistics vary on the actual impact, but the point being that President Truman issued this executive order to forestall what he thought would be even more restrictive loyalty policies by Congress. So he thought by kind of getting ahead of it by issuing this executive order, he could prevent even more restrictive measures by Congress. and this is before the era of McCarthyism. This is important to remember. This is 1947. This is about 3 years before Joseph McCarthy really takes prominence on the national stage. And the fears of communists and the second Red Scare really become even more strong. So a couple days after this, March 25th, 1947, Truman and Acheson, Truman's on the left there, Dean Acheson on the right, have the job to, so to speak, sell the Truman Doctrine and its aid program. Warren Austin was the ambassador to the United Nations. He's pictured there in the center, and he too had the job of promoting the aid package, which Congress would approve in May of 1922. But it's important to remember that this wasn't just a one-off. President Truman didn't just give a speech in March 1947 and then, the rest is history. There really had to be some hard work to promote the aid package. There was vigorous education of Congress and the press and the public about the necessity and urgency, I will underscore urgency, of the Truman Doctrine and the funds that would support it. So it was not a foregone conclusion, although Congress certainly was supportive. So in May 1947, May 22nd, President Truman signed the Greek-Turkish Aid Bill at the Mulebach Hotel in downtown Kansas City. Just a personal note there, he signed it in Kansas City because he was already in the area visiting his ailing mother in Grandview, where she lived. It's a town near Kansas City. Harry Truman, of course, was a resident of Independence, which is very close to Kansas City. The New York Times described the scene. Promptly at 8 o'clock this morning, the bill was placed on the table in the little dining room that forms part of the suite Mr. Truman occupies when he's in Kansas City. The Economic and Technical Cooperation Agreement, which is the formal name for the Greek-Turkish Aid Bill, the Economic and Technical Cooperation Agreement was later. Okay, that advanced relations between Turkey and the United States. That's something a little separate, but I give that to you to say that this Greek-Turkish Aid Bill supported Greece and Turkey, and then there was another agreement in July 1947 between the U.S. and Turkey. The Truman Doctrine, together with the Marshall Plan, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the United Nations would form the foundations of an internationalist foreign policy that prevented a Third World War and contained Soviet expansionism. The containment policy, while ultimately successful, did result in the loss of thousands of American and Asian lives in Korea and Vietnam during the Cold War. Greece and Turkey would join NATO in 1952. By 1949, the civil war in Greece was effectively over, with communist insurgents ceasing the majority of their operations, and the task of rebuilding the shattered north of Greece began. In the 1950s, Greece recovered economically, and diplomatic and trade links were strengthened by King Paul's state visits abroad. Paul became the first Greek monarch to visit a Turkish head of state. However, links with Britain became strained over Cyprus when the majority Greek population on that island there, which is in the Mediterranean, voted union with Greece, while Britain, as a former colonial power, would not endorse it. Now, eventually, Cyprus became an independent state in 1960. The Truman administration's support for Greece and Turkey was not without controversy. Greece was not a democratic country, but it was anti-communist. And there seems to be some ambivalence in Greece about Truman's role there. There is a Truman statue in Athens that has unfortunately been repeatedly vandalized, painted with graffiti, and bombed. In this slide, I want to play for you a phone call from President Lyndon Johnson to Harry Truman in March 1964, asking the former President Truman, if he would attend King Paul's funeral. King Paul died in March 1964. And I think what's so interesting about this segment, which is about 4 minutes long, is that we see Johnson giving Truman the so-called Johnson treatment. That is, he doesn't want to take no for an answer. I mean, he's very courteous and deferential in some ways, but at the same time, he wants to really underscore, he wants President Truman to be his representative at King Paul's funeral. And that's part of why I went into a little bit of the post-Truman period to point out the significance of the Truman policies and their enduring legacy. So I will play this for you now. Again, it's about 4 minutes long. You'll actually hear Lady Bird Johnson as well come on the phone.
Good. How you feeling?
Oh, fine, thank you.
How's Miss Truman?
Oh, she's all right.
Why don't you take her and Lady Bird? Let me send a presidential plane out there to pick you up, and next day or two you fly over to King Paul's funeral.
Fly over where?
King Paul's funeral in Greece.
Well, that'd be one thing to do. And I'd like very much to do it if you want me to.
I want you to, and they want the best people, the biggest people we can get in this country. They think the president ought to go. Now, I can't go. I can't leave. And
I know you can.
I figure the two next biggest ones I can get you and Lady Bird and Miss Truman.
Oh, well, that's mighty nice. I don't think she can go either. She's tied up here.
Well, tell her we'll send a maid with her. We'll send somebody to take care of her. She can sleep all the way over. And that Lady Bird will fix her a good old-fashioned bourbon and water whenever she wants.
Well, you consult her about it. And can I call you?
You consult her, and if she can't go, you've got to go because I can't go. You told me that you would, these Greek people love you, and they're few crackpots, but they love you, and I've got to have, this Cyprus thing's very serious. There are four times as many Greeks on Cyprus as there are Turks, and they're both our friends, and the Greeks been killing Turks over there, and the Turks wanted to invade them, and we told them that you can't, told the Turks you can't invade them, and we told the Greeks you've got to quit killing them.
Well, all right. That's the way to handle it.
And they both kind of got a little bit peeved at us, but we worked it out. United Nations, and now they got a mediator, and we got it all settled. They're going to mediate it. And I want to show them that we love them. And I wired cable Queen Frederica. I told her she'd had pneumonia, and her poor husband got a blood clot, and now he winds up dying. And I just got to have the best I've got, and the best I've got you and Lady Bird. She wants to say hello to you.
I'll be glad.
Mr. President?
Well, how are you?
I'm fine. And it would be so much more of a meaningful trip if you go along, because everybody remembers what you did in the time of real stress when you had to put up or shut up over there.
Well, I'll go. You tell the president I'll go if he wants me to.
That is wonderful. And I will so much enjoy being with you.
Well, thank you very much. And I don't know whether or not you were or not, but I'll talk to her about it.
Well, I hope that she can, and give her my affection, and I will be along with you at whatever time suits the convenience of you and the State Department and the whole overall planning.
Well, may I call the president tomorrow morning and tell him?
Yes, sir. Just a second.
I'll know probably in the morning when the funeral is, and I'll call you back, and I'll have a plane pick you up, and you'll have an aide, a military aide, take care of you, and you don't need to worry about a thing. You'll be briefed on everything, and you just don't run off. Don't stay over there with my wife. Just bring her back. That's all I ask.
All right.
We'll have 3 or 4 members of the delegation, but Lady Bird and you are headed.
All right.
Thank you.
That's mighty nice.
Good night. I can count on you now, Kennan.
Yes. I'll
Okay.
see you tomorrow.
Fine.
Winnie?
what's the legacy of the Truman Doctrine? In this article in 1965, in President Truman's own words, he compared America's role in Vietnam to the aid program for Greece in 1947. He wrote, "There are those who refer to South Vietnam as another Korea. There are some similarities, but in many respects the situation is very different. As a matter of fact, the case of South Vietnam is more comparable to that which confronted the Greek nation after the war, when civil war broke out and communist elements marched on the government with open Russian support. The plight of Greece soon became desperate and the situation verged on anarchy. Economic reasons compelled Britain to withdraw her forces stationed in Greece. This proved a stunning blow. We received an urgent plea from the Greek government for help. We did not hesitate long in giving our answer. This government, acting with the emphatic accord of Congress, sent word that all the necessary help would soon be on the way. We acted with decision and speed because we realized that if we did not come to the aid of Greece in time, we would in effect deliver this great and historic nation, a nation that in its day was a model citadel of freedom, to a Russian communist takeover and reduce it to another satellite. It is to the everlasting credit of our people that because of their willing sacrifices and their timely intervention, Greece was saved." Kind of an interesting analogy in Truman's own words in a newspaper article in 1965, which was just before the commitment of large numbers of U.S. ground forces in Vietnam. In 1987, on the 40th anniversary of the Truman Doctrine, President Ronald Reagan issued a statement which read in part that the Truman Doctrine was, quote, "the first post-war commitment of the United States to provide the resources and support necessary for free countries of the world to meet the threat of communist expansionism, and brought into being the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was rooted in a fundamental assumption as true now as in 1947. A healthy democracy in the United States requires strong democratic partners in the world. Its purpose was to help the peoples of Greece and Turkey in their efforts to secure their freedom. It succeeded through the mutual efforts of the American, Greek, and Turkish people, who through their courage and perseverance met head-on and defeated the immediate post-war threat. Today, Greece, Turkey, and the United States are linked together as members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, freedom's strongest shield." In 2007, President George W. Bush issued a comment on the occasion of Greek Independence Day. His statement, issued in part, read, "Americans stood with Greece again after World War II, when violent communist insurgents threatened Greece's free government. President Truman saw the danger and he articulated a new and bold doctrine for our country. Like democracy itself, the Truman Doctrine grew out of the experience of the Greek people and affirmed the desire for freedom for all people. Not just a handful, not just some, but for all." The 1987 and 2007 statements by Reagan and Bush, respectively, were interestingly, by Republican presidents. So what is the legacy of the Truman Doctrine? Well, first, the Truman Doctrine has defined how we approach foreign intervention. It argued that failing to secure the stability and welfare for people around the world meant endangering stability and freedom of stability and welfare of the free world. It was subject to different interpretations, however. Did it bind the United States to defend free people everywhere or only in certain areas of the world? How democratic did governments we support have to be? Was it enough for them to be merely anti-communist? Second, the Truman Doctrine recognized that foreign intervention is a joint economic, political, and military venture. It highlighted that foreign intervention does not need to rely solely on military action. Third, the Truman Doctrine called for the United States to lead the international community. American leadership was vital to spreading, in Truman's view, American leadership was vital for spreading peace, prosperity, and democracy around the world. Truman noted that, quote, "if we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world." what do historians say? Historian Melvin Leffler has written of the Truman Doctrine that the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the London Agreements were the decisive steps leading to the collapse of the wartime coalition, which was the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II. After the war, the Russians showed some restraint, but not enough to allay U.S. fears. The U.S. felt it needed to take the initiative, but that Soviet actions were reactive in Leffler's view. Historian Alonzo Hamby said that the Truman Doctrine reflected both his long-held view of totalitarianism, that is his being Truman's long-held view of totalitarianism as an implacable enemy of human freedom, and faith embodied in his reverence for Tennyson's poem Locksley Hall, in the eventual triumph of the universal world order based on liberal values. In this, he almost instinctively grasped what was perhaps the central issue of the 20th century. In John Lewis Gaddis's book, biography of George Kennan, he notes that Kennan saw the post-war crisis that the Truman Doctrine tried to address in cultural terms. The danger was not from rotten apples, but from cultural despair. That is Kennan's view. To abandon Europe would be to sever the roots of cultural and tradition, leaving the United States with fewer safeguards against tyranny than one might think. In such a strategy, a modified Truman Doctrine would depart from the decades of isolationism, extending back to the Monroe Doctrine. And I apologize for a typo there in that first paragraph, which I will fix. And in terms of the diplomatic impact of the Truman Doctrine, there's at least two instances of other doctrines that grew upon or were based on the Truman Doctrine. One was the Eisenhower Doctrine, which President Eisenhower issued in 1957, again based on the Truman Doctrine. It promised military or economic aid to any Middle Eastern country needing help in resisting communist aggression. It was intended to check increased Soviet influence in the Middle East, which had resulted from the supply of arms to Egypt by communist countries, as well as the strong communist support of Arab states against the Israeli, French, and British attack in the Suez crisis of October 1956. And another doctrine that was issued was that of Richard Nixon in 1969 that acknowledged the limits of the Truman Doctrine. Didn't directly address the Truman Doctrine, but it again was Truman Doctrine was a basis for it. In Nixon's view, the United States would keep all of its treaty commitments. This is the Nixon Doctrine referring to. That the United States would provide a shield if a nuclear power threatened the freedom of a nation allied with the United States, or of a nation whose survival we consider vital to our security. But, this is key, we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing manpower for its defense. If you want to learn more, and there's plenty more to learn, we encourage you to visit our website, which is trumanlibrary.org. And there you will see a collection of documents, photographs, teacher lesson plans, other resources, such as oral history interviews, and the actual audio and speech that Truman gave in March 1947, the Truman Doctrine speech you can hear on our website. Unfortunately, we don't have the video of the complete speech. We only have video segments issued by newsreel companies. So unfortunately, we don't have the complete video in our collection. But I would encourage you to learn more by visiting our website and seeing the sample of documents, because what I've tried to do today is provide an overview of a very complex and interesting subject, and I hope I've done it justice. So I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Sam. We have a nice audience on site, and as people make their way to the microphone, we'll ask them to ask questions there so that they can be heard. Yes, we have one gentleman at a microphone, please.
Hello, you asked the question as to whether the doctrine applied purely to anti-communism or did it apply to pro-democracy, and you left that as a question. As far as Truman was concerned, did it matter if it was an authoritarian regime as long as it wasn't communism? Did Truman actually come in support of democracy over totalitarianism in a non-communist viewpoint, realm?
Well, he said in this particular speech, he recognized that the Greek government, I believe the word was something like far from perfect. So, he recognized that, it wasn't a democracy, partly because I think he wanted to try to give it more time, but he realized that in the interests of urgency, he didn't really have time to wait until it became a full-fledged democracy. I think that was certainly his hope, and his hope for other countries around the world, but particularly ones that had recently come out from under colonialism. I think he realized that this takes time to establish democratic processes, but that we don't have the luxury of time, because if we wait too long, the terrible conditions that sow totalitarianism, the poverty, the disease, lack of jobs, lack of employment, lack of economic opportunities, lack of housing, all those are fertile fields for something much worse, okay, which would be out there authoritarianism of the communist variety. So I don't think he was under any illusions that this was a purely democratic country, or even that it was. I think he felt it was taking the steps in the right direction. There wasn't an election, and this is scholars can debate this all day, and I would, and I'm not certainly an expert, in this particular area, but others would say, and this is a legitimate argument with me on it, but my reading is that Truman felt that it was a far from perfect government. He recognized that in his speech, but he felt we did not have the luxury of time. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we're getting an affirmative answer. Yes, that did make sense. Thank you. I invite anybody else who has questions, if you're on site with us here in the theater, if you would step to the microphone. And
I think that's why Truman issued the Marshall Plan as well, why he was supportive of the Marshall Plan for Europe, because he saw it even in the broader sense of these other countries that suffered terrible devastation from World War II. He saw in areas like France and Italy particularly that there were vulnerabilities there. So, it was not a perfect system by any stretch. Truman's critics will point to support of the Greek government and its actions, as being not the right course to take. But in Truman's mind, he was taking the right thing for Greece and Turkey, but also even more significantly in the interest of the United States and its security.
Thank you, Sam.
Sorry, Andrea.
Thank you. No, thank you. Actually, can we take a second? I've changed my mind. We would love to see you on the video screen. If you could change the view from your last slide to you. And while you're doing that, we have a gentleman who's at a microphone and has a question for you.
Okay, so you want me to stop the slide presentation?
Yes, please. Can you switch to a view of yourself? Yay, there you are. Fantastic. Okay, we have a gentleman. Okay. Please.
Hey, Sam. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm with the Israel Institute, previously with Claremont McKenna College. My question is about the understanding of Truman in real time, about the scope of this change in U.S. foreign policy, and more specifically about whether there was any understanding that this is kind of a slippery slope from a European or a response to a European crisis to something that is more global by nature. If I'm not mistaken, there was a cabinet meeting on March 7th where he talks about the fact that the U.S. has been getting or is about to get involved once again in European politics. But to what extent, if at all, he understood that this is actually a departure and a re-engagement, if you like, with world politics per se, given the nature, again, and the scope of the East-West rivalry or conflict as it erupted later on in Berlin and other places, Turkey, of course, Iran, and so on. Thank you very much.
I think that's an excellent point. I think Truman was aware, of the global implications. I think that's why he put it in such kind of broad terms, saying it'd be a policy to resist attempted subjugation by outside groups or armed minorities. I mean, that's a very, very broad statement. And his critics actually said it's too broad a statement. Where are the limits? What are the limits to this engagement? I think Truman wanted to have the freedom to be able to define. I mean, obviously the immediate crisis was Greece and Turkey, but I think he also wanted to have the freedom to be able to expand policy to anywhere in the world where he felt that U.S. and this is important that U.S. interests were involved. Truman was a real keen student of history, and he was well aware of the Monroe Doctrine and its limited application to the Western Hemisphere. He was aware of George Washington's warning not to get involved in foreign entanglements. Truman looked to the end of World War I and the failure of the United Nations as a reason for the beginning for World War II, sowing the seeds for World War II, because the United States retrenched, became isolationist, did not become engaged in the world, and in Truman's view, that led to World War II. And, Truman was determined to put the United States on a firm footing of involvement because he felt that that was in the interest of peace, as well as the promotion of democracy.
Thank you, Sam. I invite anybody else who might have questions to come to the microphone, and we do have somebody making his way. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. My name's Caleb, and I'm from Douglas Freeman High School. How do you think the Monroe Doctrine has influenced the United States today as if he didn't write it?
Did you say Truman. The Monroe Doctrine?
I'm in Truman. My bad.
Okay, that's fine. And I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the end of your question about how it influenced what?
Like, how has it influenced us, like, on today's world?
Okay. That's a great question. As even after the Cold War, I'm glad you brought it up. As Paul Harvey might have said, the rest of the story is that the Cold War would end in 1989 or 1991, depending on how you define it, with the fall, with the coming down of the Berlin Wall and a fall of communist governments, ultimately the Soviet Union in 1991. But as we see with President Bush's comment there in 2007, there still was a relevancy there of the Truman Doctrine, and I think probably the biggest takeaways is that in Truman's view, the world has to stay engaged in the world. That the stability and welfare of people around the world are connected to the stability and welfare in the United States. And that in Truman's view, isolationism is not a policy that will enhance U.S. security. In Truman's view, contrary to the contrary, because as I say, what he saw after World War I is that isolationism that occurred. So, you want to engage with your partners to promote peace. You want to use the United Nations. So that's a part of this too. I haven't said too much about the United Nations, but that was a part of the instrument through which the United States would promote its its interests, as well as through direct, military action when necessary. But rejecting isolationism, being involved with your partners, the United Nations and other nations, being a member of the international community. Those are all fruits of the Truman Doctrine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Sure.
And do we have any more questions? Okay, I'm going to make my way up to the front here. And
I would encourage you all to see our website again, trumanlibrary.org, to see the wonderful resources we have on our website.
thank you very much, Sam.
Yeah. Encourage a visit to the Truman Library, too.
Yes, come out to see Sam in person in Independence, Missouri. Right. Thank you for doing this most unusual type of broadcast with us. And I wanted to remind everybody that this broadcast, like all of the Know Your Records programs, are on YouTube, and you can watch them and download the presentation materials. If for some reason you had a question and you didn't quite want to get up in front of the audience, feel free to send us an email to inquire@nara.gov, the word inquire at nara.gov, and we'll pass it on to Mr. Rushay. So on behalf of our presenter, Sam Rushay, and the National Archives, thank you for joining us today.